What really happens when thousands of meters above the ground a pilot decides to shut down an engine? For most passengers, the mere idea sounds alarming. An airplane relies on its engines to stay in the air, so thinking about one shutting down mid-flight seems like the beginning of a serious problem. However, in modern aviation, this situation is neither an improvised scenario nor an automatic signal of disaster. It is a situation considered from the design phase, tested in simulators, and regulated by extremely strict certifications. Under this logic, a commercial aircraft is not built on the premise that everything will always work perfectly. It is designed with the certainty that, at some point, something can fail, and the engine is part of that margin. From day one of testing, the aircraft must demonstrate that it can take off, climb, stabilize, and land, even if one of its engines stops producing thrust. It is not a remote possibility, it is a mandatory condition for certification. This means that shutting down an engine does not equate to losing control or falling. It means applying a procedure. If an engine shows vibrations outside of parameters, abnormal temperatures, signs of damage from ingesting objects, or any behavior that could compromise its integrity, keeping it running could be riskier than shutting it down. In this context, shutting it down is not a sign of the aircraft's weakness, but a decision designed to protect the entire aircraft. The key is to understand that the system does not rely on a single point of failure. Commercial aviation operates under a philosophy of redundancy. Duplicated systems, independent power sources, separate hydraulics, and structures capable of withstanding asymmetric loads. Everything is designed so that the loss of an engine does not turn the flight into an out-of-control situation. What may seem like a relatively routine procedure from the cockpit appears as an extraordinary event from the passenger seat. And that gap between perception and reality is precisely the core of this video. Because aviation doesn't wait for a problem to occur to figure out how to solve it, it practices, certifies, and integrates it as a natural part of the system. If shutting down an engine doesn't mean losing control, then a fundamental question arises. How can an aircraft remain stable and continue flying with relative normality when it loses half of its thrust? The answer doesn't begin in the air, but long before the first commercial flight. Stability with an inoperative engine is not an accidental tolerance nor an improvised capacity. It is a mandatory requirement that defines the aircraft's design itself. Before transporting passengers, each model must demonstrate that it can take off, climb, and continue the flight even when one of its engines stops producing thrust at the most critical moment. This requirement is tested during the certification phase, where manufacturers subject the aircraft to tests that simulate the loss of an engine at the most delicate moment of takeoff, with precisely defined speeds that determine when the maneuver can be aborted and when it should continue. If the failure occurs after the point where it is no longer safe to stop, the aircraft must continue with one engine, climb, stabilize, and maintain a guaranteed minimum climb rate, a capacity that is not optional and forms an essential part of technical approval. Once this capability is demonstrated during certification, the phenomenon is understood from the aerodynamic perspective, where the loss of an engine creates a thrust asymmetry because one side of the aircraft continues to produce power while the other does not, which tends to make it spin toward the inoperative engine. However, the control surfaces are designed to compensate for this effect, so the rudder neutralizes the turning tendency, the ailerons adjust the lateral balance, and the remaining thrust is managed to maintain stability within procedures that the pilot applies without needing to fight the aircraft. It is important to understand that losing an engine does not mean losing half of the flight capacity, because the relationship between thrust and lift does not work in a linear way. During cruise, the engines operate well below their maximum capacity, which leaves available power margin to compensate for contingencies. In this context, when an engine shuts down, the aircraft can maintain level flight, albeit with limitations on maximum altitude and optimal speed. It is a change in regime, not an immediate loss of control. This ability to continue flying depends not only on the available thrust but also on the internal architecture, which reinforces this philosophy. Electrical systems are usually powered by independent generators associated with each engine, but there are also auxiliary sources capable of supplying power if needed. The hydraulic circuits are physically separated so that a failure on one side does not disable the aircraft's control, while the fuel systems allow isolation of lines and redistribution of supply. Even the wing and fuselage structure is designed to withstand asymmetric loads without compromising the integrity of the whole. When an engine shuts down in flight, what changes is not the basic ability to stay in the air, but the performance. It may be necessary to descend to an altitude where the remaining engine operates more efficiently, adjust the flight plan, and select an alternate airport. All of this is part of defined procedures that pilots train for recurrently in advanced simulators. The goal is not to improvise, but to apply a protocol planned from the very design of the aircraft. The key to all of this is understanding that commercial aviation is not built with the expectation that nothing will fail, but rather built with the assumption that, at some point, something might fail. Within this logic, an inoperative engine is not an unpredictable anomaly, but a certified, practiced, and anticipated scenario from day one. The aircraft is prepared to fly with one less engine. From this arises a more specific question. Why, in certain situations, do pilots decide to shut down an engine even when it is still running? Sometimes the problem is not that the thrust disappears, but that the parameters stop behaving as they should. In aviation, safety is not measured only by whether the engine produces power, but by whether each variable remains within the expected margins. Out-of-range vibrations, excessive temperatures, drops in oil pressure, or instability in the compressor are signs that something is not functioning properly, even when the engine continues to produce thrust. Modern jet engines are filled with sensors that constantly monitor every critical variable. The exhaust gas temperature, shaft rotation speed, oil pressure, and fuel flow are recorded in real time. And when one of these indicators deviates from the normal, it is not interpreted as a minor detail, as it could be the start of internal deterioration that, if ignored, could progress into something more serious. In this context, keeping the engine running is not always the prudent decision. A clear example is bird ingestion, where an impact can damage the compressor blades or the turbine without immediately stopping the engine. The thrust continues, but vibrations increase and efficiency decreases, and if the damage progresses, internal fragments can detach, compromising the casing or causing a fire. In that scenario, shutting down the engine reduces the system's energy and prevents the deterioration from escalating. The same happens with an abnormal temperature rise, because sustained overheating can weaken internal components and turn a controllable failure into a structural one. There are also phenomena such as surge, a compressor instability in which the airflow is disrupted and can cause brief internal explosions. Although the engine may recover, repeating this behavior under load causes cumulative damage, so reducing power or cutting off the fuel supply eliminates the source of instability and stabilizes the system. The risk of leaving a compromised engine running is not only that it stops producing thrust, but that it does so violently. An uncontrolled failure can release high-speed fragments capable of penetrating nearby structures or affecting critical systems. Engines are designed to contain most failures internally, but the first line of defense remains the procedure, identifying the problem and isolating it as soon as possible. This procedure is not improvised. The crew follows a clear sequence that starts by confirming which engine is showing the anomaly, continues with power reduction and parameter verification, and, if the condition requires it, ends with cutting off the fuel and isolating the system. The aircraft is prepared for this transition, so the electrical and hydraulic systems automatically switch to alternative sources while maintaining uninterrupted control of the aircraft. The result is stable flight with one less engine, but without an unstable component generating uncertainty. The logic is simple, though counterintuitive. A shutdown engine is a controlled system. A damaged engine that keeps running can be unpredictable. In aviation, predictability is synonymous with safety. Therefore, in certain circumstances, deliberately shutting down an engine is not a sign of crisis, but a conservative decision that protects the rest of the aircraft. Shutting down an engine may be the safest option even when it is still producing thrust. This leads to a more complex question. What happens when the aircraft is crossing an ocean and there are no nearby airports to head to? In flights crossing oceans or remote regions, the possibility of losing an engine is not a hypothetical exception. It is the starting point for all planning. This gives rise to a regulation known as ETOPS, which stands for Extended Operations for Twin-Engine Aircraft, a certification that allows these aircraft to depart from alternative airports for specific times while considering the loss of one of their engines. When a twin-engine aircraft takes off to cross the Atlantic or Pacific, the route is not simply drawn as the shortest line between 2 points. It is designed by calculating how long it would take to reach an adequate airport if one of the engines became inoperative at the most unfavorable point of the route. This time could be 60, 120, 180, or even more minutes, depending on the level of certification of the aircraft and the operator. It is not an optimistic estimate, but a conservative calculation based on reduced speed and optimal altitude to fly with a single engine. To obtain this authorization, the manufacturer and airline must demonstrate extreme reliability. The engines must meet exceptionally low failure rates, and critical systems must have enough redundancy to sustain prolonged operation on a single engine. Maintenance is more rigorous, statistical tracking is more detailed, and crew training is more specific. It is not enough for the aircraft to be able to fly with one engine less. It must be able to do so for hours without compromising any essential system. When this condition occurs in the middle of the ocean, the procedure is not improvised, and the aircraft descends to an altitude where the remaining engine operates more efficiently, adjusts the speed, and heads to the pre-planned alternate airport, while communications with air traffic control and the airline's operations center integrate into the same standard sequence. The aircraft is not isolated or adrift. It follows a plan that was already defined before takeoff. What is relevant is that ETOPS is not a permission to take unnecessary risks, but the confirmation that the entire system, which includes the engine, aircraft, maintenance, and crew, has demonstrated the ability to handle thrust loss for an extended period. Under this same premise, each component is designed and evaluated, and even factors such as the weather at the alternate airport and the availability of emergency services are part of the planning. This approach reveals something essential about modern aviation. It is not about avoiding improbable scenarios by ignoring them, but about integrating them into the design and daily operation. The loss of an engine is not a marginal hypothesis. It is a structural assumption that affects routes, certifications, and procedures. That is why a flight over the ocean does not depend on luck, but on a safety architecture that considers failure as part of the system. Even in the middle of the ocean, the aircraft is prepared to continue for hours with a single engine. But there is a more extreme limit, one in which thrust completely disappears, and the aircraft must continue flying without engines. This scenario is known as a multiple flameout, a condition where both engines stop producing thrust and, far from being an impossible anomaly, is also part of the design considerations. Although the mental image suggests an immediate fall, the physical reality is different. Without thrust, the aircraft does not stop in the air, it becomes a glider. Behind this behavior is a basic principle. The jet engine maintains its thrust thanks to stable combustion generated by a precise mixture of air and fuel. When that combustion is interrupted, thrust disappears. The causes can vary, such as massive bird ingestion, volcanic ash entry disrupting internal flow, contaminated fuel, extremely intense rain in unusual conditions, or severe disturbances in the compressor. In all these cases, combustion can extinguish and the engine stops generating forward force. But the structure of the aircraft does not depend solely on that thrust to stay in flight. It depends on the lift generated by its wings as they move through the air. When both engines shut down, the aircraft maintains full control of its aerodynamic surfaces, and at cruising altitude, it has considerable potential energy that allows it to travel a significant distance for every unit of height lost. It does not fall like a shapeless object. It descends in a controlled manner while the pilot manages optimal speed and angle, and the cabin does not turn into instant chaos, but into an environment where trained procedures are applied. To sustain essential systems during this phase, the aircraft has alternative energy sources. One of these is the ram air turbine, known as the RAT, which automatically deploys when a loss of primary power is detected. This small propeller, driven by airflow, generates enough electricity and hydraulic pressure to keep basic instruments and controls operational. Additionally, the auxiliary power unit can be activated under certain conditions to recover additional electrical supply, allowing the aircraft to maintain controllability even in the most adverse scenario. The next step is not to resign oneself to descent, but to attempt a restart, as a jet engine can be reignited in flight as long as the airflow through the compressor is sufficient. As the aircraft descends, the air becomes denser, facilitating the relight process, while the system injects fuel and activates the ignition to restore combustion. In many historical cases, engines have been successfully restarted after a few minutes of gliding, and the procedure is practiced as part of recurrent crew training. This same logic is reflected in documented incidents where even the simultaneous loss of thrust has been managed when design and operational discipline work together. Bird ingestions affecting both engines, ash clouds disrupting combustion, or fuel problems interrupting supply have been overcome thanks to that combination of engineering and procedure, reminding us that the aircraft does not rely on luck, but on a system that anticipates the improbable. From this comes a central idea about modern aviation, an idea that runs through everything we have just seen. It does not ignore extreme scenarios, but integrates them into the aircraft's architecture and into the training of those who operate it. The possibility that both engines shut down is not a taboo. It is a considered and trained variable, and the difference between perception and reality reappears when the passenger imagines an inevitable fall while engineering offers control, gliding, and options. Even when total shutdown can be managed without losing control of the aircraft, the focus shifts to another essential element: the training of those who operate it and the role it plays when the design has already anticipated all these scenarios. The design of the aircraft allows one engine to shut down without the aircraft losing stability, but that capability only becomes real safety when the procedure comes into play. Commercial aviation does not depend on improvised reactions, but on precisely defined sequences that have been trained to the point of becoming structured reflexes. When an engine presents an anomaly or stops producing thrust, the first element to act is not intuition, but the protocol. There are immediate actions that the crew must perform without consulting manuals, known as memory items. These are critical steps designed to stabilize the situation in the first seconds. Reducing power, confirming parameters, and maintaining control of the aircraft are part of that initial response. After this phase, the formal checklist is used, a detailed guide that ensures each decision is verified and no step is omitted. This process eliminates ambiguity and prevents errors arising from the pressure of the moment. This precision does not arise spontaneously. It is built through simulator training. Commercial pilots go through recurrent sessions in high-level simulators, capable of faithfully replicating the behavior of the aircraft during complex failures. There, they practice engine shutdowns during takeoff, thrust loss during climb, engine fires, abnormal vibrations, and multiple shutdowns at different phases of flight. It is not about repeating an isolated scenario, but about experiencing variations in weather conditions, weight, altitude, and reaction time. The goal is not to memorize a single solution, but to develop a deep understanding of how the aircraft responds in each context. This understanding is not limited to the individual pilot. It also extends to coordination in the cockpit as an essential part of control. In a twin-engine environment, thrust asymmetry requires a clear distribution of responsibilities. While one pilot maintains control of the flight, the other manages systems, reviews parameters, and executes the corresponding checklist. This task separation reduces individual cognitive load and ensures that the aircraft remains stable while technical decisions are being made. Communication follows structured patterns that avoid ambiguities and ensure that both share the same information. Outside the cockpit, the entire air system contributes to the management of the situation. Air traffic control prioritizes the aircraft if necessary, provides direct vectors to an appropriate airport, and clears the route to reduce the operational load. Airlines maintain operation centers that offer additional technical support, providing weather data, estimated performance, and viable alternatives. What is important is that this entire process is standardized. Shutting down an engine does not trigger a heroic improvisation or last-minute intuitive decisions. It activates a set of steps that have been practiced repeatedly under controlled conditions. Predictability is the core of safety. When every action is defined in advance, uncertainty decreases and the margin for error is minimized. The combination of redundant design, structured training, and external control creates an environment in which even a total engine shutdown can be managed with technical calm. The aircraft responds as it was designed to do, and the crew executes procedures that are part of their continuous training. The result is not a chaotic emergency scene, but a controlled transition to a new flight configuration. With all this on the table, the final question becomes inevitable. Is shutting down an engine in mid-flight really a sign of danger, or is it the clearest demonstration of how modern aviation is designed to anticipate failure and turn it into something manageable? In practice, shutting down an engine does not bring the aircraft closer to collapse. It confirms that the system is responding as it was designed, because modern aviation is not built on the hope that nothing will fail, but on the certainty that if something does, there must be a clear, effective, and pre-planned response from the design. A commercial aircraft is certified to fly with an inoperative engine from the most critical phase of takeoff. This means that the loss of thrust is not an unexpected void, but a structural scenario. Aerodynamics accounts for the asymmetry, electrical and hydraulic systems have alternative sources, and the structure supports any additional loads that may arise. The aircraft does not become fragile when one of its engines shuts down. It simply changes its operational configuration. The planning of long-haul routes reinforces this logic. Flying for hours over the ocean under ETOPS standards explicitly involves accepting the possibility that one of the engines may stop working. This is not a risky concession, but an authorization based on proven reliability, enhanced maintenance, and detailed procedures. Each segment of the flight is calculated, assuming the worst possible point for the loss of thrust. The system is not surprised by the failure, it has it integrated. Even the most extreme scenario, the simultaneous shutdown of both engines, does not equate to an uncontrolled fall. The aircraft maintains lift, can glide considerable distances, and has auxiliary power sources to maintain control. Restart procedures are defined and rehearsed, and documented incidents show that the combination of design and operational discipline allows power recovery in many cases. The key that runs through the entire system is standardization. Pilots do not improvise in the face of an anomaly. They apply sequences trained in high-fidelity simulators where they have practiced failures under the most unfavorable conditions. Within this same logic, the distribution of tasks in the cockpit, the rigorous use of checklists, and coordination with air traffic control are part of a framework that reduces uncertainty. So when an engine shuts down, the aircraft and the crew activate a protocol that has been repeated countless times before. Commercial aviation has reached its levels of safety precisely because it does not ignore the improbable. It analyzes it, tests it, and incorporates it into every phase of design and operation. Shutting down an engine in flight is not an exception to this rule. It is a direct manifestation of it. It is not the beginning of a disaster, but the evidence that the system anticipates the failure and is prepared to manage it without losing control. Ultimately, what it really means to shut down an engine in flight is that the aircraft does not rely on a single piece to remain safe. It depends on a complete architecture that assumes the possibility of failure and turns it into a manageable situation. That is the real difference between perception and reality. Where vulnerability is imagined, there is foresight. If you are interested in continuing to explore how engineering turns improbable scenarios into controlled situations and discovering what really happens behind every decision in the cockpit, subscribe and join us in the next videos. Here we continue analyzing, without myths or dramatizations, the machines that make flying something ordinary.